Yeah, for now, I think we should give the floor to our first panel, consisting of Budhaditya Chattopadhyay and Sharon Stewart. A short introduction on both of them. Budhaditya is a contemporary artist, researcher, writer, and theorist, working across diverse media such as sound, text, moving image, and incorporating various technologies such as sensors, AI, and machine learning. Budhaditya produces large-scale installations addressing urgent societal issues such as the climate crisis, human intervention in the environment and ecology, and questions concerning migrations, race, and decoloniality. And Sharon is a member of the ArtEZ Professorship Theory in the Arts, where she focuses on ethical practices within artistic research, and in tandem with that, she's a sound artist herself, as well as a core teacher for the Center of Deep Listening, and she's also an associate editor of the Journal of Sonic Studies. So, Buddha and Sharon, let me invite you to the virtual floor. Let me see, Auke. Yes, you're spotlighted, Buddha and Sharon as well, and I will leave the screen right now.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Sharon. Nice to see you again. So I'll take the liberty of sharing the screen, particularly some slides that I would like to present as in support of the presentation and the ideas, some thoughts that I would like to share today. It's the project is titled, my contribution for the Polyphonic Landscape project is titled Co-Sounding Towards a Sonorous Land, which is at the initial stage. So what I'll be sharing is kind of embryonic, and they are very much willing to responses from the audience, and particularly the critical friend, to develop further and enrich itself. As Peter mentioned earlier, landscape, the word, is often understood as a particular place and then adding scape, but also landscaping, like a verb marking on the land, or making boundaries on the land. So I would focus on the scape, the suffix, and I'll invite you to think through the visual aspect of landscape, and also other words, similar words like soundscape or cityscape. So Western culture has upheld a visual order as the dominant sense modality, in which the definition of landscape is framed by the visual reference. This visual thrust manifests in the suffix scape in the word landscape, which denotes an extensive view or scenery or a picture or representation of such a view of land as perceived by humans. In the hierarchy of the senses, in the anthropogenic realms, particularly in the Western cultures, sound has often been considered a subdued and minor sensing of the land and the environment, though listening is often proved to be a revealing socio-political force. How does land sound? How can we shift the perception and imagination of land from silent pictorial representations to an embedded and composite multisensory experience? Whether the shifting of the order of the senses helps to counter the hegemony of visual mediation and rendering of land into aesthetic objects for consumption and commodification. For example, in the form of landscape paintings Peter mentioned earlier, a prevalent form of fine arts in Europe. How can the foregrounding of the ephemeral and ineffable orality may give voice to the unheard? So these are a few of the questions I'm trying to address in my contribution and the research process. In the Netherlands, landscape painting has been one of the celebrated genres in 17th and 18th century art making. The growth of capitalism and the wealth of the independent Dutch Republic needed a new national identity that would lead to a revolution in, for example, in fine arts, painting, known as the Dutch Golden Age, in which landscape painting was in abundance. Many Dutch painters were known for their realistic depictions of lands that were distinctly different from earlier periods. Dutch landscape painting is generally characterized by dramatic contrasts of light and shadow, cold and warm colors, and marked by an aesthetic representation of land with human affordances. However, when these landscape paintings were authored with care and craft, parts of the world outside of the European fortress, now coined Global South, were teetering under the violence perpetrated by European colonialists and imperial regimes. Netherlands was also a stakeholder in these enterprises. The Dutch West India Company and the Dutch East India Company in the early 17th century were considered the largest and most extensive maritime trading companies in the time and held almost like a monopoly on strategic European shipping routes, enabling colonial expeditions to expand through east and southern lands and territories, well known to Europe for their abundant natural resources. The company's domination over global commerce and colonial trades contributed greatly to a commercial revolution and a cultural flourish in the Netherlands of the 17th century, the Dutch Golden Age I mentioned earlier, a time when landscape paintings also took hold in the realms of the fine arts. But this is also the time when the greater parts of the East and the Global South were slowly getting occupied by the European colonizers through extraction of land, manipulation of natural as well as human resources, and exploiting labor. The strategic and forceful extraction of land caused three major and many other famines in India alone. The notorious Bengal famine of the 1970 caused more than 1.2 million deaths, and another larger famine in 1943 caused more than 4 million people's die. These famines were largely caused by the colonial policies of land use by East India Company. Back in Europe, in the Netherlands, the flowering of the Golden Age stood on the conquest of the East and the Global South, causing an abundance of wealth and a resulting opulence. The lush and rich landscape paintings that we encounter hanging on the silent walls of the rich museums today did not reflect these otherworldly acts of violence in the colonized lands far away. Their aesthetically gorgeous exteriors frame a sense of contentment and complacency, which disturbs me. The silencing of the colonial realities in these paintings urges me to uncover the layers that are not heard. How to sonify an inert painting by listening in between the shades and make it speak out the hidden truths. How to rethink the acts of radical listening and co-sounding as gestures of decolonial intervention and collective action. How to consider sound as a transgressive force that reveals layers of silenced realities. Colonial extraction and plunder of land, displacing and dispossessing human and non-human life forms ingrained in the land. In The Ascent of Man, Jacob Bronowski wrote, among the many relationships that define the human condition, the individual's connection to the environment is primary. We aspire to leave our mark, inscribing our observations and gestures within the landscape, attempting to translate and transgress the space within which we find ourselves. The sonified landscapes that I aim to work on in this project, in this contribution, may function as a mirror and a lens to uncover spaces transfigured by excavation, extraction, mining, among others, as well as artistic rendering, such as landscape painting, in which the plurivocality of the land with human, non-human, and more than humans are reduced through objectification and aesthetic framing for human consumption. Through these human interventions and actions, land masses on the earth have entered the Anthropocene, new geologic era, you all know the term, defined by unprecedented human-made impacts over Earth's environment and ecosystems. In this era, ecological integrity of natural lands is made severely unbalanced through an imposed nature-culture binary, as Bruno Latour underscored in his work, We have never been modern. In the field of contemporary art, materiality and objecthood have been contested topics after the advent of digital technology in artistic production from the late 90s. In my artistic research trajectory, Expanded Object, I have been trying to respond to a central question, whether sound can be exhibited as an artistic object, and whether this is problematic, considering the nature and characteristics of sound predominantly emerging as an invisible and immaterial phenomenon spilling over any artistic object framed within an exhibition setting. This question complicates the positioning of sounding arts or sonic arts in the gallery or museum-based curatorial practices and in the history of art, demanding a new set of theoretical approaches and methodologies. In addressing the central question from a historical perspective and a practice-based approach, in this research strand, I examine how sound can negotiate materiality and objecthood by emphasizing the unfolding intersubjectivity embedded in listening act and opening the art object enclosed within an exhibition to be more participatory, responsive, alive, and active. Sounds, when they are plurivocal, collective, situated, and supportive of a sense of social multiplicity, can have socio-political agency to disrupt the status quo and reveal injustices. Brandon Lovell, in his book Sonic Agency, Sound and Emergent Forms of Resistance in 2018, underlines sound's invisible, disruptive, and affective qualities, and questions whether the invisible but embodied nature of sound can support political transformations. He argues for sound's role in creating alternative, unlikely publics in which to foster mutuality and dissent. Salome Voegelin, in her book The Political Possibility of Sound, Fragments of Listening, in 2018 as well, discusses possibility of the political power of sound and listening that includes creativity and invention, imagining a politics that desires to embrace a connected and collaborative world. In this context, co-sounding towards a sonorous land is an artistic research that delves into a sonically empowered unpacking of the landscape, focusing on the site of Amstelpark in the Netherlands, which is a man-made nature, much like the landscape paintings this project focuses on. The project intends to inculcate a dialogic context within which an intersubjective approach to the perception of land as an equitable habitat of human and non-human life forms is developed. This mode of reciprocity and intersubjectivity helps to counteract the nature-culture binary with an ambient and environmental aesthetics. The complacent and stagnant landscape paintings of the colonial era are reread and animated sonically, thus making them susceptible to questions of decoloniality, Anthropocene, rights of nature, and ownership of land. I will pursue the claim that sound is less closely tied to the Kantian category of substance than vision, and therefore any attempt to frame sound into an artistic object or artifact, what is termed sound art, to materially tie the viewer with it poses problems of a philosophical nature. In order to respond to this problem, in my earlier writings, I have been developing an idea termed mise en sonore, for example, in the book, the auditory setting, which denotes the spatial dynamics of the sonorous space, of the mise-en-scène of an exhibition, for example. The concept is built upon the consideration that sound and listening-driven arts are inherently perceptual and participatory, and the bridging the gap between an artistic object and the listener's mind is necessary in any public showcasing of such works. Therefore, it is important to create fertile auditory situations where sound can affect and activate multiplicity of interpretations, experiences, and moods at the listener's end than trying to devise a material object or artifact in its so-called exhibition in situ. Taking the ontologically questionable space of the exhibition as a critical juncture, I would like to take a practice-based approach to consider reorganizing the conventional space of an exhibition as a fertile context for self-reflection and participatory engagement by withholding the visual information as if on a photographic canvas, instead leading the listener's attention to the many layers of situated listening to earth and the ground with a decolonial and interspecies plurivocality that essentially spills over the frame in question. As an approach to subvert the artistic object of the exhibition, sound is positioned to spark an object-disoriented experience that encourages evolving intersubjectivity and revealing multisensory engagement. To conclude, I will take a very critical positionality against soundscapes, the term often used by Murray Schafer as one of the seminal bodies in the development of sound studies or soundscape studies. In my book, The Auditory Setting, I have taken a critical attitude towards the idea of soundscape and soundscape composition, in which sounds can be mastered and composed as a durational object. Instead, I underscored the situationism and flux in a moment of environmental listening. Drawing on this approach against soundscape, I will develop a series of participatory and responsive situations in the contribution co-sounding towards the sonorous land, transgressing and transforming the historical landscape paintings into context-aware portals to read problematics of human-centric perception of land by opening a landscape through sonic raptures that generate horizontal situations to disrupt the concept of landscape, to invite equitable participation and plurivocal narratives. Thank you.
Thank you, Budhaditya. It's nice to be here with you. I hope can you hear me all right? Or am I a bit soft?
I can hear you clearly.
Okay, thank you so much. So I've known you also through your writings, also for the Journal of Sonic Studies, and one of your dissertation. I have this in honor of our working together on audible absences. So I want to also maybe unpack this idea also of about taking field recordings. Now you've positioned yourself as also, I think, but you can clarify that as working within the field to decolonize sound studies, maybe a bit, maybe I'm not saying that completely correctly. And I'll apologize, this is the longest question I have with some theoretical things. After this, there'll be a bit more to the point. But also taking into account the use of field recordings. So you have scholars like Dylan Robinson, who explicitly, with hungry listening, contributes toward this decolonization. He raises importance of critical listening positionalities, which in some ways you refer to becoming attuned to our filters as listeners being aware of these histories also of colonization or being colonized, in which our listening is grounded. And geographer and artist Amr Khan-Gieser, she speaks of the academic and artistic white possessive within field recordings and even listening practices, and explicitly addresses the care needed and the limitations to what one call permission to extract sonic material from the environment. So there is this arising sense of the complications around thinking of listening and field recording. as maybe already neutral or benign activities. And Stephen Field, who you mentioned explicitly in your proposal, but not now, he, as you said, he writes against soundscapes acoustomology, and we'll talk about this later, refuses to sonically analogize or appropriate landscapes with all that physical distance from agency and perception. But likewise, it also refuses to replace this visualist ocular centrism, so focus on the eye, with sonocentrism as any sort of determining force of, and what he calls essentialist sensory master plans. So it's also not replacing the idea of all knowledge coming through the eyes with no knowledge comes through the ears. So taking explicitly to your methodology that you're applying here, how do you think that you will avoid maybe the violence of visual mediation through the use of sound within the frame instead of the visual field? So how is sound, say, inherently different for you?
Sound, the order of the senses often marginalizes sound. Often there is a visual, as we discussed earlier in Peter's introduction, and I kind of elaborated on why scaping as a word, as a suffix, is like for grounding the visual hegemony, and that disturbing that hegemony is already a political act. To kind of imagine a horizontal sensory modalities, they're working with each other, not necessarily marginalizing one another. But the sense of equity in the sense that in sensing and meaning making is already something that is a political, socio-political intervention. And given that, sound acquires an agency and a currency when we try to make this intervention with sound, like for grounding on an equitable horizontal level, sound, the oral modality. Also, I mentioned earlier the political agency of sound that many scholars are trying to point out in recent writings in the field of sound studies. Brandon Labelle and Salabe Vogelin, two examples I shared, both of them highlight this possibility of listening, situated listening, as powerful to mobilize social questions. And often, as we know from some canonical seminal writings on the development of sound arts, for example, Brandon Labelle's Background Noise, Alan Licht, or Seth Kim Cohen, they have been trying to develop the idea of sound as a social medium. Social medium meaning that sound not only stays on an evidence, in a visual evidence such a painting or a photograph, but sound always spills over that evidence and touches bodies, making social connections. That sociality is something that I can consider as a political methodology. So for me, to underline this sonification of historical landscape painting is political because it exposes and reveals different layers which are often unheard in a visual realm. So sound giving those realities, those components or those elements voice by sonifying them is already something that I consider a political intervention.
Thank you. And in the idea of situating yourself, say, with the land, with the sound, maybe the more than human or the non-human, how do you do that as an artist? How do you really situate yourself within, and I'm not going to use the term the landscape, but within this relational and reciprocal environment? How do you do that in your work?
Yeah, already you mentioned reciprocal and relational. Those are few of the terms that can be discussed further on how we can distance ourselves from the extractive practice of field recording, how we can build an intersubjectivity and rather autoethnography, a mode of autoethnography that not estrange myself as someone observing from outside and taking, extractive evidences as analysis of an experience, but rather making my presence felt, making me as part of the collective that we share together. For example, being on a place of land or being on a field often feels like I'm part of the entire conundrum. The evolving auditory situation is not estranging me as someone coming from outside, but something that is associative and relational and intersubjective. And that is something I have been mentioning in my sharing of my project idea. That intersubjectivity is something I would like to develop further. How we can find intersubjective relationality with experiences that I'm trying to keep a trace in some of the recordings I make, but also not recording sometimes recording in text, or sometimes thinking, sometimes contemplating, sometimes withholding evidences, sometimes let's say lying on the ground, putting my ear to the earth. I just listen. That is enough. So different methods of being there, being on the field, and trying to figure out how my body and my presence is responding to being there. And that sense of autoethnographic mode perhaps disrupts the critical, the uncritical field recording practices often understood, like field recording as a sound art practice, to having a critical attitude towards that practice.
Thank you.
I also like to develop.
It's also very evocative, that feeling of sense of laying on the ground and also listening. That's that immediately puts you in a different position. And this, maybe we talked a bit about this term epistemology. You talk about an unpacking, epistemological unpacking, and so that comes from Stephen Field, and it's the joining of the words acoustics with epistemology. So it's a way of theorizing sound as a way of knowing, as he explains in his chapter, Epistemology within Keywords and Sounds. And in quoting him, it says, in so doing, it inquires into what is knowable and how it becomes known through sounding and listening. So you already started on this about, can you explain to us your position as artist, interlocutor, as a person in dialogue? How does this unpacking take place? And you talk also about the dialogic context. So maybe you can consider in the different fields of relationship between the different parties, you as artistic researcher, your sonic environment, but you also do have materials, sound materials. You're going to eventually be presenting this with the audience, the listener, and you have this dialogue also with Dutch landscape paintings, which you have a very critical approach to, but they're also guiding you in where you're listening. So it's this nice, in a way, maybe not totally ambiguous, but it's being used, the landscape paintings are being used to guide, but also in a critical way. So it's a long question, but I think, yeah, you're nodding, so that's a good sign.
So epistemology is a term which is quite popular, I would say, after Stephen Feld mentioned it in many articles and a book chapter, I think. I like the term initially, but I also find it's problematic because it's tongue-in-cheek, and those kind of terminologies often they become fetish, and that is a problem for me. But I also use it sometimes just to focus on the potential of sound as a revelatory phenomenon or event or experience, but not necessarily sensing always involve knowing. Knowing is one particular stage of sensing, but sensing can also happen in more than knowing context, such as affect. So epistemology, acoustics and epistemology, connecting them together is often limiting, I would say. So I would remain with sound and listening as open and broad terms, and not focus on epistemology as a terminology rather, because affect is also something, or intuition, or these different approaches of sensing and being in the world are also necessary to understand, and at the same time of knowing. Secondly, your second question was about landscape paintings being guides. Yes, of course, landscape paintings is an established form, and who am I? I'm just a young artist and researcher. So landscape paintings already in an established form, and it's historic art history is, there is abundance of our landscape paintings being part of the writing of history, fine arts, contemporary arts as well. So I'm just taking a polemical position, which is useful for generating new knowledge, perhaps new perspectives, new effects, new points of entry. So distancing myself from landscape paintings would be counterproductive. So I'll just take landscape paintings as something that sparks another narrative, or a discursive narrative, or something that can enrich itself by questioning through taking a polemical position. And for example, exploring sound and situated listening as something to redefine and reconfigure what landscape painting represents, and how land can have another modality of understanding than landscape painting. So landscape painting as a genre can have useful impacts on development of this research strand. So yeah, that's my response to ambiguousness or ambiguity of that intervention is embedded in not distancing but engaging with landscape painting.
Yeah, and thank you for going into that. And so now, and then also this, if we consider the other late dialogic fields or the ways of interaction, just getting down to the nuts and bolts of it, like what is your project? What will it be? And maybe it's nice to first talk about the maybe the spacing of it, and then we can go into the interactivity of the project. Is that okay? So kind of, what do you envision in here?
At this stage, I'm developing the technical logic, like using a lot of sensors, computer, and playback devices, amplification, routing devices. So multi-stages of technical logic that I need to develop, how one component can join the other. I'm at this stage of this project. Once I understand the feasibility of this technical flowchart, or connecting from one to the other, then I can understand how I can employ that understanding into something exhibitory. So at this stage, what I'm thinking is to being in front of a number of canonical landscape paintings, some of which I shared in the slides, and then a combination of subjective interpretation and scientific tracing back to the possible locations or similar locations. I'll visit those sites, those locations, and I'll study being there, and I'll also find resonances in my presence as a listener on those sites and lands, and then figure out this intersubjective development of a dialogue through sound. Some of them might be traces of some recordings in the form of some recordings. Some of them will be traces in the form of some automatic writing. Some of them will be contemplations that will help develop the project. So these different modes of being there, guided or sparked by being in front of a landscape painting, because landscape paintings are often figurative and they're kind of realistic. Dutch landscape paintings, they're very realistic. You can imagine the location which inspired, or a multiplicity of locations that inspired this painting. It's an interesting process, perhaps, to trace back some of the locations and listen to those locations, how they sound today, in the contemporary time. So it's not scientific translation of landscapes into soundscapes, but rather an intersubjective engagement with the landscape, with the sonic as the dominant mode, to just balance out the visual domination of those landscape paintings.
Yes, thank you. And to be honest, I could not see the slideshow. I think maybe because my video is on. But do the viewers have an idea of what they might encounter? Was that
Yes.
shown in the slideshow? Okay.
Okay. So in the exhibition, what I'm imagining is to work with a number of canonical landscape paintings. I'm thinking of 12, and I have gathered 12 frames, antique frames, through flea markets and through going to the kringloops in Netherlands, and those very well framed, that frames, like antique frames, empty. And I'll develop canvases by cutting woods and make cloth in the front, like a proper canvas, but white, no images on them. And then they will be thick enough so that I can put speakers behind them. So each canvas, 12 of them, each canvas will have a system or multitude of systems. One system would be speaker playback system, which is a 5.1 or 6 speakers. These playback system will be connected to amplification, of course, and a routing device, which will send 6 sounds randomly to the speakers through a spatialization that will be a result of the interaction in the computers and the sensors. And then the second module or system would be the computing device, which will have a code in Python or PD. We are still collectively developing this code on a logic I developed, and that code will have 2 layers. One would be sensing, one would be computing and playing back. So the playing back of 6 open sound files will be through filtering, 3 filtering stages. One would be pitch, changing of pitch. So the parameters that I would like to change of the sounds based on the audience interaction are threefold. One being pitch, one being frequency spectrum or equalization, and third being volume, the obvious one. Mm-hmm. And sensing will have also the same kind of parameter setting. There are 3 sensing modules I'm using. One is ambient sound sensor, one is capacitive sensor, which measures distance, proximity of the audience in front of each canvas, and another is a light sensor, which measures light in the room. For example, is it daytime or afternoon or evening, so that the climatic or weather patterns can also be translated in the form of sound. So sensing devices will be the third module that I'll be using. So it's a very complicated system, to connect one to the other. It needs a lot of research, which component we use, how to convert analog signals of the sensors to digital signals that a computer like Raspberry Pi can recognize. So this is something I'm stuck at this stage. Mm-hmm. And once I kind of solve these riddles, mm-hmm. then the next stage will appear when I can stand in front of a landscape painting and get inspired by it or get disturbed by it. Those processes will follow once I know the modality and the visibility.
Yes. Yeah. So
Hi there.
Yeah.
Hello. I have one question. We have only a few minutes left. So maybe some last question. And then I think it's also good to have some space for the audience. And I would like to ask you, Buddha, if you could share maybe your screen again, because some people weren't able to see it. And I just wanted to check very quickly if the problem has been solved now.
Is it visible now?
Yes, now it is also visible for me as well.
Yes, okay, that's beautiful. So this problem is solved. So if you could with the last question, Sharon, and then afterwards I would like to open the floor to the audience. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes, I was just coming to my last question. We discussed a little bit, I guess as artists, maybe you're never satisfied, but in what, how you could think of the audience as playing these sounds, I should use soundscapes now as a word, playing these sound bits as like an instrument, or engaging, but there's also another layer to it. And I asked a provocative question, and I'll do it again. Would you be satisfied if people came into this room with the empty paintings and listened and thought, oh, how lovely, just like with light, playing with light, you can create landscapes. You can also do that by working with sound to create, you know, these beautiful soundscapes. So it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I'll leave it to you. How do you want to engage your audience?
Yeah, it's not a soundscape composition at all. These are auditory situations which are constantly in flux based on how audience imagine being in front of them. So close on proximity and a bit distant. These are positionalities audience can play with, and they will viscerally understand the change in sound forms. And the sound recordings are not necessarily soundscapes, but they are traces of the interaction an artist would like to share with the audience to create cumulative environments. Cumulative in the sense that audience participation will only activate the listening experience. Otherwise, there is no sound. So that movement, or creating or changing dynamics in an exhibition setting, would make sounds possible to emanate from the speakers. So yeah, it's a playful environment rather than a fixed durational composition on a timeline, but something that is a situationist and more in like a flux.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm gladly open it to audience members. Thank you, Joop, and Peter as well. Thank you, Budhaditya.
I wanted to thank you both as well for this very interesting presentation and conversation. So now the floor is open to members of the audience. Please let me know if you want to pose a question to Buddha or Sharon. Yeah, Jimena?
Yes, thank you very much, Buddha and Sharon, for this very interesting conversation. And Buddha, this is a question for Buddha. Thinking of all these, I will use the word, at least is my perspective, of saturation of, let's say, recording acoustic environments. I have seen a tendency of going into synthesis. So using sensors, electronic sounds, and things that we can somehow abstract, but also in a way of synthesis. So I just wonder, of course, I don't know what we will hear, but when I see your sensors and I imagine what will be the generation of those sounds, even if it's processes, and I remember probably a bit of some of your improvisations. So I just wonder about your reflections on acoustic environment recordings and all what you have discussed already, and these approaches of using technology to somehow bring ideas or thoughts or experiences to synthesis.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I have been thinking through technology for a long time already, because I come from an engineering background and then studied sound and then new media. And there has been always a critical polemical position against technology, particularly the Western, the way understood as technology, like transistors or recording devices or cinematographic motion picture camera or photography. Those are Western modernist tools or technologies that I would like to take a critical attitude towards, because these technologies have been deployed throughout the colonial periods as tools for surveillance, control, objectification, and commodification, as well as, divisive attitudes towards the colonial subjects. So it's a given for me to take a critical attitude towards technology. But at the same time, I know that technology is not limited to the colonial mode of understanding, that transistor happened through, development innovations during the wartime. Tapes, magnetic tapes emerged for military use. So the genesis of these technologies often we know, but the technologies that come before modern times, like pre-modern technologies, that I'm also interested in. And I've been working on a paper in which I discuss some of the pre-modern technologies. And I figured out those technologies, for example, tuning systems, instruments, pre-modern instruments such as Nadasaram, or particularly South Asian instruments, Nadasaram or Rudravina, they are tuned not with a mathematical system in mind, but they're tuned on a very intersubjective way. Like you tune an instrument by hearing it, and the human error, an error in listening and different ways of listening can be incorporated in the tuning system. They are not accurate, they have errors. And that sense of error is one entry point to understand pre-modern technologies. Second is the material that they engage with. For example, gourd. If you go to some of the instruments made to resonate or using a resonator, most often those resonators are coming from nature. Like, for example, a gourd for Rudravina. So technology might have a different understanding when you expand the colonial mode of technologies from a larger trajectory of technologies which existed prior to modernism or the modern times. And from this larger trajectory, I have developed a sense of poetic engagement with technology. Technology is not just a tool to produce an experience, but technology is also something that you poetically interpret. You can interpret it in a certain way that is sometimes contemplative and not necessarily just a tool, but with having its own agency. And that sense of poetic engagement with technology leads me to not synthesize just for synthesizing, but as a portal for understanding environment as well. So often in my works, in my AI works, for example, Dhwani, a project I have been developing in the last 2-3 years, I use this portal as something, or I think through the technology as something, as a mode of enhancing participation rather than a tool. So synthesis is far away thing that I will be incorporating this in this project, co-sounding, but rather organizing some sensory modalities of sound by participatory engagement of the audience will be helped and supported by the technology of sensing, the sensor technologies and the codes.
Thank you very much. Very nice. Thank you.